where we had our greenhouse space, and we're primarily doing veggies and all that kind of thing, but we're also able to experiment with a lot of woody plants and different tree crops. The hort farm manager, of course, wouldn't let us just put them in the ground there, but we were able to have an incubator to get these things going. And it's when I first discovered the trifoliate bitter orange, Poncirus trifoliata, through a great seed company called J.L. Hudson Seedsman, who, if you've never heard of them, they're out of California, and they have a huge wide range of mostly perennial and woody trees and shrubs, which was always a fun thing to try to crack the code. You know, you grow a tomato and it pops right out of the ground, but trying to grow trees and shrubs from seed is often a whole different thing. So I saw this description for a flying dragon citrus, and it said it was hardy to USDA zone 5, which is, you know, far colder than we ever fathom getting. It's like -20 or 30 or so. And started growing these weird little contorted spiny citrus with you know, the three leaves, and they didn't look anything like the citrus I was used to. Of course, we mostly just think of lemon trees and lime trees and sweet oranges and Florida orange groves. So that's sort of what I first delved into it. And upon coming back from, you know, the East Coast, that's like Arctic ice ball come wintertime, to the relatively very temperate Northwest, the options for what you could grow here were just out of control, and got me really going down the rabbit hole of seeing what we could grow here and seeing what other kind of folks in similar climates had experimented with hardy citrus and found things that really work in zone 7, zone 8 around the country, mostly in the Southeast, East Coast, and then also on the West Coast. So the native, how do I get this to change? There we go. The original wild ranges of all these citrus cultivars centers around Southeast Asia, and it's the most confusing taxonomic puzzle because humans have had such an intertwined relationship with citrus for so long that it's very difficult to piece out where specific species came from. There's intense hybridization, I mean, to this day, between all these species, but this is sort of the main list of species that gave us all the commercially relevant ones we have today. So the sweet orange, grapefruits, pomelos, mandarins, lemons, limes, and this is where they all came from. The origin of, you know, when they first started speciating and breaking off and becoming far more diverse was the foothills of the Himalaya mountains, which is not a spot that people would normally think of as, you know, where citrus grows. And it's actually where some of the really cool cold hardy ones that have been collected by collectors like Jerry Black, who started Oregon Exotics back in the day, if any of you remember that great mail order nursery. He was up collecting in the Himalaya mountains. And as we know from, you know, the Himalayan blackberry, things from the Himalayas are well adapted here, although that one was sort of renamed as Himalayan blackberry, so that's not a great example. But other plants collected around that region, similar hardiness to us, can adapt really well. So this shows us too where sort of the origin was and where things sort of speciated out from. So you got the citrons, like the atrogs, the Buddha's hand kind of things, Mexican lime, and then it goes all the way down into Australia, where you get what's considered a different genus called microcitrus of the finger limes, the Thai limes, and then up to Japan over here is Tachibana, the Citrus ichiensis, the Ichieng pepita. It's a very cold hardy but very bitter citrus that grows pretty far north, and then things like mandarins, kumquats, pomelos, things that we're more used to. And it's particularly these things that grow up here in the more northern latitudes that are of great use to us, because a lot of these climates, and a lot of the places, particularly where these citrus have been selected from, are not that different from our climate. And one of the things too with the hardy citrus that I think is been a really cool thing to show people is, I think it's a testament to how mild our climate is. People think of Oregon as and Washington as, you know, sort of cold, rainy, and it is those things at times, especially this entire spring. But it's also a fairly mild temperate climate. I mean, in zone 8B, where we are in Portland, there's a lot of things you can grow that most people don't associate with the typical Northwest garden of rhododendrons, Japanese maples, camellias, and so on and so forth. So as much as it is a study in, you know, the diversity of this fruit, it's also a very cool study in our climate and what can be done here. So for that reason too, we really like turning people onto these sort of fringe crops in terms of being on the fringe of their cold hardiness, because it gets them to pay a little bit more attention to the incredibly unique place that we call home and that we garden in. So we can dive into some of these fung cultivars. This is the one I had mentioned earlier, Poncirus or Poncirus. I spelled the genus name wrong. Sorry about that. I spelled it right over here. This is by far the most cold hardy of any of the citrus and has been widely used in creating many of the hybrids to create unique new hardy citrus, because this one is hardy down to like -10 at least. Some people say -20. So if you can cross, say, a sweet orange with the Poncirus and the citrus genus, being a very promiscuous bunch, allows you to sort of cross anything with anything to some extent. You can get these very interesting hybrids of things that maybe have sweet orange or pomelo or grapefruit or mandarin in them, and then you have a little bit of the Poncirus blood, as we say, mixed in with it, and it can create some really interesting, more hardy citrus. This one has also been widely used as a rootstock, and that's primarily where a lot of the selections have come from. All around Florida, California, all the commercial citrus orchards, almost all of them have some degree of Poncirus in the rootstock there. The fruit on these are sour and very bitter, but also very fragrant and useful in making dressings and marmalades and all sorts of other flavors. And you'll notice this is a theme with the hardy citrus, is that many of them are not a fresh eating mandarin that you would just get at the grocery store with the little cutie sticker and pop it in your mouth and have it be so sweet. Most of them are more on the scale of flavoring, similar to how we use lemons and limes. It's not for fresh eating, which that sometimes turns people off, but I'm like, well, if you could grow the equivalent of a lemon in your yard, that would be very exciting, don't you think? We're working on some that are very, very sweet to eat, or more sweet compared to the Poncirus bitter orange. But most of these are most useful in making dressings and marmalades. People are fermenting them into alcoholic things, or making jams with them, or adding some sugar and making all sorts of different baked goods. But we'll sort of go from like the really cold hardy, bitter, but also aromatic and delicious, to the more tender but sweet and fresh eating ones. The next one we got here is the yuzu ichandrin. This is a pretty popular one, or at least it's gaining popularity. There's a number of IPAs that are even made out of it here in Portland. And it is definitely one of the most useful hardy citrus for our climate, because of just how totally hardy it is. We have one of these planted in the ground at our nursery in a very exposed east facing, like just gets thrashed by the gorge winds, and it's currently in full flower and doing just fine. So this one is a really easy one to grow, and really culturally significant in Japan and other places where they've used the fruit for a very long time, mostly using the juice from it and the zest. And it is a intensely fragrant, really just full of these amazingly aromatic oils that a little tiny bit of it goes a really long ways. We brought a friend of ours who's a chef a handful of yuzu fruit last fall, and he was making these amazing ceviches with it, and it lasted him like a week at his restaurant of just using a little bit of this yuzu juice, because it is so concentrated and delicious and pretty famous in a lot of parts of the world. And a lot of people are, trying to figure out where they can buy yuzus, and I'm like, I don't know where you can buy them, but you can certainly grow them in your backyard, and it's one of the easier fruit trees to grow, all things considered. A cousin of the yuzu, we got the Sudachi here, also really culturally significant in Japan, especially in particular parts of it. It's a hybrid of a yuzu and one of the ancestral Japanese mandarins. They make ponzu with it, and it's really great for flavoring fish dishes. And it's an odd one because it's picked when it's still in this green phase here. So it'll eventually ripen to be orange. And some people say it's quite sweet, but how it's traditionally used is zested with that green skin, because apparently the oils in the skin are much more intense before it's fully ripened. And so that's what they're using to make all their different fish-based dishes and ponzus and dressings and what have you. This is one that we're really excited about, that we're just now getting more into production, that was first brought back by a guy that I mentioned earlier named Jerry Black, who ran Oregon Exotics down in Southern Oregon. And he brought this back to the States back in the days when you could easily move citrus across borders. And this is a good time to mention that citrus is now heavily controlled and regulated and quarantined because of a disease called citrus greening virus, or Huanglong Bing, that's spread by this little Asian citrus psyllid. And it's so bad that it's essentially decimating the Florida citrus crops. They're having to go and tear people's homegrown citrus trees out of their backyard. It was found in one spot in California, and so every nursery you see in California, there'll be a tag on every citrus tree that says, you may not move this outside of citrus quarantine zone X, because it is so detrimental to the citrus industry, this virus, that it's really, got people quite alarmed, and for good reason, which makes me say, well, this is all the more reason to research and grow these things in a climate that so far doesn't have that disease pressure, and could potentially be a really interesting new crop for the Northwest. And there are people I know in Hood River, on the outskirts of Portland, who are growing these things on a more commercial scale now. But anyways, getting back to Jerry Black, back when you could bring the citrus wood into the United States quite easily because that wasn't so controlled, and pre 9/11, it's easy to move things back and forth quite easily. Collected the Ichang lemon and high elevation Himalayan mountains and brought it back, grew it out, and it's been sort of in circulation, but not widely cultivated. And so this is one that we're gearing up, doing tons of cuttings on and growing as many of these as we can, because it really is a perfect lemon substitute for us here. I've had people say that it's even tastier than a lemon. Other people also say it's not as tasty as a lemon. Part of this might have to do with climate and the amount of heat you get to ripen them, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit. But it's these really big fruits. This is my friend Evan Short, who lives down in the Applegate Valley. His hand, where they get some really cold nighttime temperatures, way colder than we get here. So So yeah, this isn't some toddler's hand that makes the fruit look huge. Evan's a big dude with huge hands, and that's how big the fruit is. And he was making all sorts of stuff like salmon with the Shangwang lemon. That's another name for it, or Ichang lemon. Making margaritas, making all sorts of stuff. So a really interesting, new, super useful one that we're working on making a lot of here soon. Then we got Citramello, another one that's long been grown. Sean Hogan famously had one on the south side of his Northeast Portland home, and would make, all sorts of wonderful grapefruit juice things out of it. And again, this is one that's been hybridized with the trifoliate orange. So it gives it that degree of cold hardiness. It's pretty much as tasty as a lemon. The trifoliate orange often adds a bit of sort of like a perfuminess to it, like a more all those volatile oils and unique things that make the trifoliate orange what it is. When you hybridize these things, you often get a really interesting, sometimes more bitter, but sometimes that bitterness adds to the flavor, especially chefs trying to get those interesting bitter flavors out now, but a really aromatic flavor as well. One of the cool things about this one too is there's these huge blossoms that precede the fruit, and it's almost worth growing for just its blossoms alone, because this time of year it's pretty late this year for the blooms because of our lovely winter spring weather, but they really are quite astounding and just perfume the air everywhere when they're in full bloom. Now moving on to sort of the more a little bit more tender, not quite as bomb proof as the other ones. These are ones that when we get the Arctic Express or the next Arctic blast coming out of Canada, you might have to be a little worried or go wrap them in something, depending on how established they are and how old they are. But kumquats are one that often surprise people in being really quite hardy, and they've been we've had some in the ground the past 3 years here, and not that we've been all that cold, even though we've had some pretty miserable snowy ice storm type events, but really they've thrived in all that in all that weather, and it's really nice to eat fresh grown Oregon kumquats come late fall. And the only thing to consider with these is definitely putting them in the right microclimate. If you put them just right out in the open, exposed to the wind and all that, they might not make it. But a south facing wall with a little bit of protection when they're young, they often can do it. This last sort of broad category is the hardy Satsuma mandarins, which has been one that we've been after for years, trying to find one that's really, really hardy here and also tastes really good, because there's a lot of them that are pretty darn hardy. They got some of the Poncirus blood in them, but they're just, they don't taste that good, or they're kind of dry. They don't, you eat one and for the novelty, but you don't want to eat a ton more. But we've worked on getting the Arctic Frost and Orange Frost introductions from Texas A&M. These are ones that they're putting on their own roots and are supposedly quite hardy, and have so far been doing just fine for us. We've had one in the ground at a friend's place on Sauvie Island for about 4 years, and it's been just fine. These next ones, the Chiang and Karaji Satsuma, are not quite as delicious, but still pretty good. We were down at Rolling River Nursery, which I don't know if any of you remember Rolling River or shop there. They're still a nursery, actually, so I shouldn't say remembered, but remembered when the original owners were running it, and they had just a huge array of very interesting things. And they of course have all these plants in the ground in Northern California on the Klamath River, where it's also a zone 8B, a little bit, not quite as cool and cold of a zone 8B as we usually are, but nonetheless still get similar low temperatures to us. And we were eating them this fall with Mark and Karina, and they were pretty fantastic, even after hanging on the tree for a really long time. We also got the 10 Degree Tangerine. I believe this is one selected in Georgia, or maybe it's somewhere else in the Southeast. But a lot of these other selections have actually come from folks in the Southeast who are also a zone 8, can get even colder than we do, but the cold usually doesn't stick around very long. They usually warm up pretty quick the next day. And they've made some really cool selections, especially after big winter cold events come through, and can really thrash some plants. People often go and select for either like seedlings that have popped up that made it, that were maybe crossed with something interesting. But they go through and select the genetics that are most cold hardy. And that's what happened too with this China Satsuma S series. I forget which part of China it was in, but a really pretty gnarly winter storm came through and killed most of these Satsuma orchards. And these were, huge array of genetics. Farmers have been planting different things for a long time. And they were able to import a bunch of them back to the United States, and they just gave them different numbers. So it's China Satsuma S2, S4, S6, all these different ones. But they all have a great degree of cold hardiness to them. And then Japan is another place where large amount of Satsumas have been selected for their cold hardiness and also early ripening. If you ever see the word wase, it means early ripening, essentially. And so we've been trying out a lot of those, both just like to grow as houseplants for people where they can get a delicious fresh eating Satsuma in the shorter seasons that we sometimes have. But we found even outdoors in the ground, they'll ripen here just fine, even in the sometimes cooler little microclimates. So the hardy Satsumas have definitely been, sometimes it's because you need the challenge to grow something that's not quite as surefire, and it tells you about your season too. It tells you how cold the winter temperatures were. You get some real data when you find out what lived and what died, even if it can be heartbreaking sometimes. And then the last thing in terms of varieties that I'll spill on y'all is all these really interesting, very hardy hybrids that people are coming up with. Some of them are accidental, some of them are very intentional, but people have been crossing things, of course, with the Ponsarus, like we talked about, but also yuzu and kumquat hybrids, finger lime and yuzu hybrids, which I'm really curious to see what the fruit of that looks like, because it's apparently has the segmented fruits like a finger lime, but the aromatics of the yuzu, and then things that are really complex hybrids between Duncan and trifoliate orange and sweet orange and all that, and a whole lot more Ponsarus hybrids that are being developed at cold hardiness. And you got it. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. For sweeter tasting fruits, and sometimes it's similar to this US 119 where you have the trifoliate crossed with, in this case it was a grapefruit, and then crossed back again with a sweet orange to really give you something that has the cold hardiness to it, but then also a little bit more sweet, delicious flavors. So now this is probably the thing a lot of you have been waiting for while I rant and rave about all these fun varieties, but how we actually grow them here, which can be part of the challenge, because the same variety planted in one location might survive the winter far better than one planted in a slightly different location. So one of the biggest things is siting plants in the right spot, even just around like a suburban urban house or whatever, or a big rural property, a south facing slope versus north facing slope. think most people are pretty aware that you're going to have a lot better luck with these kinds of plants on the south facing slopes. But similarly, in the urban environment where you have these different heat traps and heat radiating from houses, you can really sort of become a zone warmer on the south side of your house than you might be elsewhere, or just planted out in the open ground. So we're always trying to utilize those spots, especially for something like citrus that doesn't grow that large, to cram them into those hot little spots and get some things that otherwise might not make it through the winter. The other thing is, of course, full sun. These are sun-loving plants, and especially in our climate where we're a higher latitude and don't quite get as much sun, it's pretty important to have that. Well draining soils is another one, and that can be difficult for the Northwest because we often have some heavy, wet, saturated soils in winter, but citrus often do best on a sandier soil. One way we've workaround we found with that is the flying dragon Ponceres rootstock really does a great job of tolerating the wet soils, and we've planted stuff in some pretty, I don't want to say swampy, but wet, heavy soils that have made it just fine when planted on Ponceres rootstock. So yeah, the hottest aspect possible. And then one of the biggest things is just to get them really well established over spring and summer, so that when they go into that first winter, I should say winter, not spring, they'll be well hardened off. Ideally a little more woody. We have to say the rule of thumb, like when the main trunk is at least as thick as your thumb, they should have a much better chance of surviving winter than if it's just a tiny little 1/4-inch stick that you just slapped in the ground. Fertilizer is something you can't skimp on with citrus. It's similar to blueberries, where they have a very particular fertilizer regimen. They want an acidic fertilizer, and they're very heavy feeders. And if you don't feed them, they will likely not produce that much or grow that much. We have a lot of tricks for protecting young plants, especially in their first winter. Sometimes it's like if you can get them through the first like 2 or 3 winters, they'll be good to go and off to the races. But sometimes the first year you plant them out, we get a really bad winter. So sometimes we need to cheat a little bit with the incandescent old-fashioned Christmas lights or little miniature greenhouse structures that we build, or electric heating coils, things like that. And then rootstock. This is a big debate amongst hardy citrus growers on if the Ponceres rootstock actually makes things more hardy, or if it is a myth. One idea is that because it's a fully deciduous citrus, it helps the plant sort of slow down and go to sleep for winter, so it doesn't just keep growing and then get that new growth zapped. Other folks say that own-rooted plants work better because if a really hard winter frost does zap the plant, what comes back from the roots, which is often, protected from insulation of soil or snow if we have snow, what those root suckers that come back are true to type, and then you still have the fruiting scion that you were after as the thing that's growing. But most people still side with Ponceres is more hardy, but we're trying a lot of things out side by side to see which ones really work best. And we got some fun experimental orchards happening right now. Sometimes planting them in places where they're higher elevations, so we're kind of hoping that they get more frost, because then we actually can learn something and figure out how hardy they are. Our climate is sometimes hard to test things in for hardiness because it doesn't get that cold, and then we're left saying like, well, it made it through 25, but 25 doesn't tell us very much. So we're intentionally trying to push that envelope and get things in colder microclimates, in more rural areas, high elevations, things like that, to see what they're actually made of. And it's always tough because the winter temperatures might not have killed them. If they had had a hotter summer and were able to harden their wood off more, or if they hadn't had so much water and pushed all this vegetative growth far into late fall. So it's sometimes a nuanced thing. It's not like just putting an apple in the ground, but it's exciting. These are some of the ways we creatively get the little baby citrus through their first winter, and it, you know, adds a festive appeal to the nursery when the citrus are all covered in lights, and these lights are the old-fashioned ones, the incandescents that give off a little bit of heat, and it doesn't seem like it would be much, but just that little bit of heat, especially when it's like hovering at 30 and it keeps the plant above freezing, or even when it gets colder, that little bit kind of goes a long ways, especially when you encapsulate it in a little tent. This tent will likely not frost the entire winter, even if we get really hard frost into the low 20s, because it's trapping that heat from the ground and also from all the little lights that are in there. So yeah, this is our last slide, just trying to get people excited about it because it's so much easier than growing them indoors. We have folks who are often new gardeners who might not be, you know, the best at watering and identifying pests and all that, which citrus, especially indoors, are prone to. And so we're usually trying to tell them, like, no, don't get the Meyer lemon, get the yuzu and just plant it outdoors, and you'll have a lot better time, arguably a far more interesting fruit, and you won't have to go through all the hassle of moving things in and out from summer and winter. And they're really gorgeous trees. We have a lot of friends who plant them and never harvest the fruit. They just enjoy the plants themselves, because they're, for the most part, very evergreen. Sometimes if it gets really cold, they'll drop their leaves, so don't be alarmed if your citrus tree drops its leaves. They usually come right back. In our experience, especially like during that ice storm, it seemed like some of the ice just like ripped the leaves right off. But they were just fine and went on flowering and fruiting like nothing had happened the next year. But they're also just really fun conversation starters, we think, and having a citrus in the garden can get people, especially people who, you know, suffer from plant blindness, to maybe consider what we can grow in our climate and what a huge diversity of things the zone 8 climate and the Pacific Northwest, for all its, you know, stereotypes of what plants do well here, get people to kind of open up more to the kinds of things you can grow in your garden. And especially for like local food people who are like, I don't want to buy a lemon or an orange that had to get shipped here from so far away. It's like, well, you grow a yuzu and have all your lemon juice for part of the season come from the gorgeous ornamental tree in your front yard. So yeah, it's one we're excited about because we really do think they're easier to grow than some of the more common fruit trees that people often put in. Like if it was the choice between a citrus, a hardy citrus that is, and a nectarine or an apricot or a peach, I would always recommend folks go with the hardy citrus, because I think they're going to have a easier time and a much less stressful time, and it's not going to get leaf curl, and they really do flower and fruit with the right varieties pretty reliably for us. So that's my current take on the hardy citrus for here in the Northwest, and I'm sure in a year or two we'll have found, hopefully, a bunch of fun new things and learned a whole lot more as we continue to experiment with all that. But that's what we got going for now. So I think Janice said we got some time for questions and all that.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Sam. What a very interesting topic and presentation. Thank you so much. I do actually have a couple questions, and if the rest of the participants want to send some questions to Erica and I in the chat box, then we'll start asking Sam those questions. You mentioned propagating and using the wood. Do you ever use seeds?
Yeah, we do actually. In fact, when we were visiting Mark and Karina, who ran Rolling River and were huge hardy citrus proponents, they were like, you should take a bunch of this seed because we are hundreds and hundreds of miles away from anywhere that HLB, the citrus screening, has been, and it doesn't get transferred via seed. And you can do Chiang and all these things, then they basically come true from seed. If anytime we do things from seed, we just still label it as such so that people know that it's a seed grown plant, because they'll take longer to fruit and there's the possibility of some mixed genetics, but citrus also have a knack for coming true clonally via nucellar seed propagation. And so they usually come pretty true to type, unless you're making intentional crosses. And then you can usually see that with the foliage too. And that's how we get these fun, interesting things where one out of the batches looking really unique, and you grow that out and see what
See
comes
what
of it.
happens. Sure, that's great. So interesting, very